Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Evening, everybody. So glad you could join me tonight because we have a great book we're going to be talking about, one that I thoroughly enjoyed and one that is worth reading more than once because there's so much material in it that you're almost forced to go back and reread it to catch things that you didn't see the first time. We're going to be talking about Gregory Shushan's. I know one of those ways I think was correct. We'll figure it out later. He's written a book called Near-Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations, and it's a concept that I had not ever thought about, but you know, it is something that we dwell on today. But he goes into it so beautifully. He reveals the powerful influence of near-death experience on religious beliefs and ritual practices throughout human history, focusing on 5 ancient world regions in Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, and Mesoamerica. He explores each civilization's afterlife beliefs, and he explains how each of these civilizations developed independently of one another, and yet there is a series of similarities among afterlife beliefs, too consistent and specific to be mere coincidence. This leads to the profound implication that afterlife beliefs are not entirely invented by cultures. They also stem from universal truths derived from the NDEs. And if any of you have ever met anyone who has had an NDE, you'll know how impactful they are, the experience, and how it does change your life forever, for sure. Gregory is a historian of religions, an award-winning author, and the leading authority on near-death experiences and the afterlife across cultures and throughout history. It's wonderful to have an expert like this joining us today. Welcome to the show, Gregory.
Thank you, Barbara. Thanks for having me on.
Did I get your name right one of those ways?
One of them was right. Yeah, Shushan.
Okay, it was a matter. I'm going to throw them all out there. One of them has to hit. Your book it was fascinating, and
thank you.
You know, I've looked into many of these cultures, certainly Mesoamerica and Egypt, little of China, so a little of India too. It's amazing how you look into a culture and you don't really think about what their philosophy is about near-death experiences. You kind of just assume that everybody's always had them, but you know, you don't have proof of it in many ways because NDE is a term that has been, you know, coined regionally recently, and certainly, how do you determine in an ancient culture what was an NDE? And you've done a beautiful job. I mean,
Thanks.
Your stories and the research you've done is profound. Does it bring you to? I mean, you do come to the conclusion that it's the near-death experience is derived from somewhere deep inside of us, I guess, and that each culture has its own interpretation of what it is.
Mhm.
And it was fascinating. And the different cultures you're looking into, they were not all the same time frame. They were
Exactly.
sometimes thousands of years in between. What
Right.
what kind of fascination led you to this book? I mean, it's a fascinating subject, but how did you get drawn into it?
Through a kind of circuitous path, actually. I was, unlike most near-death experience researchers, like Bruce Grayson or Kenneth Ring or Peter Fennick, I don't really consider myself a near-death experience researcher, but a historian of religions. But I was always interested in the phenomenon. When I first heard about it as a youth, as a teenager, I thought, wow, that's an amazing thing that people clinically die for a period of time and then come back and talk about these things that happen to their consciousness when they're supposed to be dead. And so that kind of, the idea of it kind of lodged in my head. And then later I was studying Egyptian archaeology. So I came from ancient history, archaeology, religious studies, a kind of combination of those fields. And I was reading the earliest examples of the Egyptian afterlife guidebooks that help the soul on the journey to the other world and negotiate what the afterlife is going to be like, so they can kind of attain the most ideal afterlife state. And as I was reading, these are the texts, by the way, that preceded the Book of the Dead. So the pyramid texts and the coffin texts. So even earlier, basically, some of the world's earliest expressions of any kind of religious belief anywhere, and also of the journey of the soul in the afterlife world. So as I was reading these texts, I started thinking, if you strip away some of these very typically Egyptian cultural elements, such as the sun god Re and caverns and names of places and names of gods, then we're kind of left with something that looks very much like a near-death experience, because they describe the soul of the dead leaving the body. In this case, it would be the mummy,
Mm-hmm.
traveling through darkness, going into another realm, meeting a being of light who is the sun god Re, and all these other deceased relatives, having an evaluation of your life. So all these things that were mirrored in near-death experiences. And so I started thinking, um, is it possible to make a case for afterlife beliefs, being grounded in near-death experiences in different cultures? And so I thought, because we don't have any actual narratives of NDEs from ancient Egypt, I thought maybe if I do a cross-cultural comparison of afterlife journey beliefs, then maybe I could kind of come up with this model about how that came about.
Well, it was fascinating to me in that um, there were so many similarities and yet still differences. But it I think what I kept looking at was like, what about past life experiences? Can they be linked in with this too?
Mm. Yeah, in this book, I didn't really come across many examples of people who remember past lives of the kind that we're familiar with from the work at University of Virginia and Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker and these kinds of people. Um, but later on in another book I did called The Next World: Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. In this one, I did look at the intermission memories of people who had these kinds of past life memories. And by that, I mean the state in between lives. So some of these children would remember not only their previous personality, but they would remember how that personality actually died and the
Mm-hmm.
experience that happened to them before their new rebirth. And so they would say things like, I was hit by a truck or whatever caused their death. My
Yeah.
soul left my body. I could see the accident site. I went to another realm. I met a being of light. I met my relatives. All these kind of very NDE like experiences once again. But then instead of returning to their body, which would happen if it were a near-death experience, they instead enter a new body to be reborn in their new reincarnation. But what really struck me about that was that the description of that state and of that experience very much mirrored a near-death experience. If you didn't know the context of it and you didn't know that they were born in a new body instead of going back to their old one,
Yeah.
you would probably think it was an account of an NDE.
I know it was what fascinated me, really fascinated me, was when you were going into the different near death experience experiences from a lot of these ancient cultures, you got great detail. I mean, really, really. I mean, they were there to. It was sort of like the journey of Ulysses. It was, I have to go, I have to find something, I have to bring it back, and I have to save my mother or whatever.
Yeah.
And currently, if you're looking at current day on NDEs, they don't have the detail that the antiquity had, and I kind of was confused with that, because certainly people today are far more comfortable with relating what happened. Even agnostics talk about they're amazed because they can't believe that that this has happened to them. And the one of the main things, though, that is similar to me, that I found profound, was that when people came back, they had a more profound life. They had a life where they were serving others or helping others, and the purpose of the journey was to, I mean, it was a very spiritual experience for them. They weren't, going back for the lottery numbers or something like that. They were going back to have something to save one of their relatives or something like that. They wanted cures and things like that. So so that it almost feels as though the ancient near-death experiences in many ways had a more meaningful experience to it than the current ones do. I mean, when I've interviewed a lot of people that have had near-death experiences. Now, the changes in their behavior and in their lives because of the near-death experience are profound. But none of them had the kind of stories that you gave, especially with Egypt and China.
Yeah, I think so. I guess the way to explain this is I was basically looking at three categories of texts. So I was looking at the religious beliefs in an afterlife, including things like the Egyptian description of the journey of the soul to the other world. Then I was looking at myths about descents to the other world. Like an example of that is the descent of Inanna from ancient Sumer. She's known as Ishtar later on, and there's a myth where she's a goddess associated with the planet Venus and with love, and she descends to the other world underground to overthrow the reigning queen of the other world, who is Ereshkigal, her sister. And it's basically a story. It's a plot with all of these plot elements, and she overcomes, different dangers and threats, and then she's transformed at the end. And it's very much a story that was used as a teaching tool, I think, about the afterlife and also about the cycles of nature and different other kind of mythological, metaphysical concepts. And then on top of that, the final category, which I didn't even expect to find, were actual historical examples of near-death experiences that didn't have the mythology or the religious context. So there were examples from ancient China. I think the very first one is probably from ancient Sumer, and that's about a king named Bilgamesh, who in later texts he's called Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the famous Sumerian mythological text. But this one particular chapter seems to have been deleted from the epic. It was an earlier one that was confined only to ancient Sumer. And Bilgamesh was actually a historical king. We know that he existed as a real person. And this text describes how he's lying on his deathbed and his soul leaves his body and goes to the other world. And he meets the sun god Utu, who is obviously a being of light. And he also meets a panel of judges who are also radiating light, and they help him to kind of evaluate his life, which is very much like an NDE concept. And they review the kind of deeds that he did on Earth, but in a very much ancient Sumerian context. So the things they were judging him on were things like, did you build temples, and did you conduct the correct rituals, and treat your people with benevolence as a king, and all these kinds of things. And so they decided that he did have a good life, so they would make him a judge and a kind of semi-divine being in the underworld. Then before going back to his body, he meets his deceased relatives. There's a feast and a banquet thrown in his honor. And then he's eventually returned to his body, and he prepares his funeral, and he's able to plan with foresight about his coming death. So that's presented. It doesn't involve a kind of story about gods. He meets the gods, but it's not about them. The story is about him, this historical person.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that it's so much more like a near-death experience than the myth of Inanna or some other god descending to the otherworld myth is really significant. But at the same time, I think that those myths are drawing on near-death experiences. They come from a place of people knowing about them, and also probably shamanism, people knowing how to kind of use this technology of getting to the other world through different kinds of techniques of consciousness, freeing your body, or through dreams and visions and things like that.
Yeah, there's a great deal of I got to wondering, knowing that this concept is there, knowing that it's happened in every culture, in every time frame throughout time, even unrecorded time, it's still there.
Mm.
My theory has been that we don't really utilize all of the tools that we have inside of us yet. We haven't developed to do that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so that this kind of an experience is telling you there's so much more. You look at how the Dalai Lama, how the next Dalai Lama is always found by finding, excuse me, a child that can identify and answer questions about the previous life of the one that is past.
Right.
So that there is that capacity inside of us. What does this tell you about today, about what our life is for here on the earth plane? What, things that we're capable of, and that when we experience them, it changes us and shifts our whole focus on life.
Mm.
Is this something that really should be taught, should be shared with people, should be open, people should be more aware of the fact that this concept is there to help to better the lifetime you're now currently living?
I think it should be, and I think there's a valid reason for listening to the testimony of people who have near-death experiences, possibly even giving them priority over traditional organized religions, because those religions are teaching us concepts that have evolved and changed and been overlaid with human thinking and
Yes.
human agendas and different kinds of I guess agendas is the best word, really. Modified
Dogma.
and exactly. Whereas people who have NDEs, they have or claim to have direct access to the things that these organized religions have been writing about and elaborating upon for all these centuries. So I would say it's a kind of more immediate access to the types of things that they're writing about. And almost universally, people who have NDEs cross-culturally throughout the world, throughout history, as you mentioned earlier, they come back with positive messages. They're not coming back and saying, you need to go start a war. You need to go oppress these people because they don't look like you. They're coming back and they're saying, you need to teach people that we're all one, that we survive the death of our bodies, that we're spirits having a physical
Human
experience.
journey.
Or even things like, there's a particular kind of plant that grows on this mountain. You need to go there and harvest it and bring it back, and that will help cure your people of this disease that's affecting them. Or on smaller scales, and there's a Native American example where they said, you need to go back and tell your people to stop the practice of wife beating. You need to stop making offerings to the dead because it's a waste of resources, and we don't need your offerings here. Just use them for yourselves. So it's always some kind of positive thing, whether it's for the community or an individual or whatever it is. And anytime that I've seen that there's a negative kind of message, it seems to be a fake near-death experience. It's a scam, essentially. There's one from 1940s or 30s, Melanesia, where a guy claims to have a near-death experience, and he comes back and says he met Satan, and he tries to start a satanic cult, and he starts trying to take advantage of people and exploit people. And it's pretty clear that he heard about NDEs somewhere and he made up this whole story. And there's another example like that of in the 1930s in America, there's a man named William Dudley Pelley who professed to be America's Hitler. And he claimed to have an NDE, and he claimed that during it, he learned all kinds of things about racial segregation in the afterlife and eugenics and all kinds of other things. And I think that's probably an invented NDE. And again, he heard about the phenomenon and thought, okay, now here's a way to amass some followers and get some power and get donations and exploit people's spirituality.
Yeah, it's not exactly something that I would volunteer to go into.
Mm-hmm.
However, what I'm fascinated by is the people that actually do have the NDEs aren't necessarily people that have studied spirituality and stuff like that. Quite often, they're people. My favorite story, one of my favorite stories. I interviewed a girl who was 18 or 19. She tried to commit suicide a number of times. And when she finally had her experience, she came back so different. It was amazing. And she said to me, "You have to understand, I did fly. I did fly. There's no doubt about it. I was carried, through this void, this tunnel." And she said, "But you have to understand." And she kept saying, I had to understand. She said, you have to understand. I wasn't called by love. I wasn't surrounded by love. I wasn't protected by love. I was love. And I sat back and here's this girl that had been mutilating herself, that tried to commit suicide, that she suddenly became love.
Mm-hmm.
And she was sent back. She met, I believe, her grandmothers or relatives who told her it wasn't her time and she had to come back. And she didn't want to because it was so peaceful and she was at peace. And they said, "You take that peace back with you and create it in your world."
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what she did.
Mm-hmm.
But to hear her after hearing about all the awful things she did, that she suddenly said, "You have no idea what it's like to feel, to be love, not to feel it, but to be it." And that to me was the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah, there's another interesting example that comes to mind of a British empirical philosopher who has built his whole career on being basically an atheist materialist kind of philosopher. He had a near-death experience and he came back and the first thing he said when he came back to life was something like, "I saw a divine being. I'm going to have to change all of my opinions and rewrite all my books."
Yes.
He later then recanted because he thought better. He thought, well, wait a minute. And he kind of looked at it from a different perspective. But his wife said, he's a much nicer person since he died and came back. So, but I think both of these examples, they're actually kind of microcosms of what I'm talking about in the book, which is the kind of fancy name for it is the experiential source hypothesis, which just means that people are having these kinds of extraordinary experiences and then developing their beliefs based on them. So if it can happen to an individual, like the woman you mentioned, or the philosopher that I mentioned, it can then happen to an entire culture or society, because it's the people who, who have these experiences that talk about them, and then they gradually will kind of lead to new beliefs among everyone else.
Well, yeah. I mean, if it was a spiritual person that it happened to, you'd kind of say, "Yeah, right, of course." But when it's an atheist, or there was one a while back about a surgeon who died, watched his body and everything, and came back, and you have to believe him because he didn't believe this was possible. He was a man of science. He was, not spirit, science. And it's to me, it's a wonderful way of seeding the population with a philosophy that is more than a philosophy. It's a basic truth. But it's not a dogma. You don't have to believe it. you'll figure it out when you die anyhow. You know, but these people came back to spread a message of sorts, not create a religion or anything like that,
Right.
but to help you to discover while you're still here the spirit that indwells within you, and make a connection consciously with that spirit, depending on you know what you choose to practice, like whether if it's meditation or religion, whatever it is, it helps you to become a better person. And I think that's what I found so fascinating. You know, your work is very different from a lot of other people's. You know, you're going into a part of the field that not many people have traipsed into. And what I was fascinated with was all of the different stories, and they all had great similarities. You know, whether it's a tunnel or there were so many. Talk a little about some of the similarities between all of the different cultures, because they are a little bit different from what people are experiencing now, but not really that different. So let's look at some of the same experiences that you saw across culturally.
Sure. Yeah. So what I basically found was that in the afterlife beliefs of all of these ancient civilizations, it seemed like there were about 9 particular elements of near-death experiences that seemed like they were superimposed onto the beliefs.
Yeah.
So those were leaving the body, seeing the body from a perspective outside it. So the out-of-body experience, which I called the corpse encounter in the book, because it was more like the profound element of that was kind of the acknowledgement, the realization that you're outside your own body, but you're still alive and you're still conscious, and therefore you've survived your own body. And that realization kind of leads the soul to be able to progress into the next stage of the experience, which is something that near-death experiencers also talk about. And then entering darkness, coming out into another realm, usually a realm of light, meeting a being of light, meeting deceased relatives, some kind of evaluation of your life on Earth, of your deeds and your actions. Let's see, what else was there? There was no being sent back to the body in the guidebooks to the afterlife, because obviously they're not about NDEs, they're about what to expect in the other world. But I think they were written with information from people who had NDEs. It was the NDEs who wrote these beliefs out, essentially. And then there's also the feelings of oneness and unity with the divine. There's a lot of examples of the soul of the dead becoming divine or merging with different deities. But there's also a sense that they retain some kind of separate individuality. So in Egypt, for example, there's lists and lists of all the gods that the soul of the dead is associated with. But at the same time, they don't seem to be totally subsumed in them. They don't just become completely one, because they still keep an identity. And then they even describe how each part of the body is associated with a different god. So your arm is Seth and your other arm is Osiris and whatever else. So so and that idea of transcendence and unity with the divine is cross-culturally kind of manifested in different ways, but it's always there. And I would say that it's the same for pretty much any of these elements. They're cross-culturally explained in symbolic, specific ways, but the theme is pretty much the same everywhere for those particular elements.
One wonders if the culture sort of determines the sort of experience one has.
Yeah, that's a real chicken or egg question, isn't it? Is the experience written about in cultural terms later, or does the person actually have an experience that's culturally symbolic? I think it's probably both, actually.
Well, if somebody in Egypt now has a near-death experience, are they necessarily going to, find themselves in a boat going across the river Styx or whatever, or is it going to be more reflective of the consciousness that they have now, what their consciousness creates for them?
Yeah, I think they would be less likely to have like a pharaonic Egyptian
Yeah.
NDE and more likely to have a Muslim NDE and see Muhammad or whatever. Um, and that really raises the question of, the being of light, I think, is a great example of how to try to unpack the whole
Oh,
culture
yeah.
versus genuine experience, because there's that being of light. Atheists will often say, I saw a being of light. Christians will say, I saw Jesus. Buddhists will say, I saw the Buddha.
Yeah.
Muslims will say, I saw Muhammad. So are they all seeing different entities genuinely, or are they all seeing the same entity, which they're projecting their own cultural symbols onto? I think it's probably that, but that's something that I think there's not really any way of really determining in any truthful way until you get there and find out for yourself.
Yeah, and you can't come back and write a book. Well, you can, but then
Yeah,
that,
but you,
that's
be,
then your experience. So
yeah, exactly. And because of the way you've experienced it, you might be completely convinced that you saw Jesus, but you might have been projecting Jesus onto a neutral divine being of light who's a universal being for everybody. But you're
yeah,
seeing Jesus because that's the way that's going to comfort you, which is what it kind of says in the Tibetan tradition, that you will see the clear light of pure reason in whatever manifestation is most comforting and relevant to you.
yeah,
But the
because
ideal is to see the truth behind the illusion that you're superimposing on it.
well, with a lot of ancient cultures, they talk about beings of light, teachers of light,
Mm-hmm.
so that and the shining bodies, and you biblically the shining bodies of the angels and stuff like that, so that we're depending on where we are religiously speaking, we're going to look for somebody that glows.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
And that is practically universal. That was one of those things that while I was doing this research, um, I went into it. I don't want to say from a skeptical point of view, but I went into it thinking I'm going to go where the evidence leads me, because that's what you do as an archaeologist and as a scholar. That's my training was kind of in, this is evidence-based kind of work. So as I'm reading, Sumerian text saying, and this deity of the underworld was radiating light, and then I'm reading an ancient Chinese text, and this the emperor of heaven is radiating light, just over and over and over. It really astounded me to keep finding that same motif everywhere, especially considering how common it is in near-death experiences.
well, also in at least today, um, biblically speaking, if you go to the Bible, yeah, the angels glowed,
Mm-hmm.
and Noah glowed when he was it Noah who glowed? Yeah, I think so. That they're talking about people that glow,
Mm-hmm.
and if you look at even oh gosh, look at people today still will see a glowing figure, and that figure will morph into what is most appropriate for their own religious background.
Mm. I'm doing a new project now on near-death experience in classical antiquity, and I've been reading the account of a man named Scipio Africanus, who was talked about by Cicero, the ancient Roman philosopher.
Way back, yeah.
Yeah, and this account, and actually a couple of other Greek and Roman accounts, say how the soul that embodies the human is actually from the realm of the stars, and we're basically the light of the stars is what's in us, and that's what animates us and makes our bodies function, and that those souls rule our bodies the same way that the gods rule the universe. So again, that association with the divine and the being of light is inside us, essentially, is the belief.
Yeah, there's also the philosophy that some of the scientists are now touting, that we are in a three-dimensional world that is a holographic projection from a two-dimensional world.
Mm-hmm.
so that our spirits, our real spirits, are connected to that world, and that we become physically a holographic projection,
Mm.
not actually the real spirit.
Right.
And so it's I love the way science tries to squiggle around all of the spiritual stuff and
Yeah.
make it their baby.
Well, I actually think that if there really is an afterlife, if near-death experiences and reincarnation and all these things actually happen, if they're really true, I don't see them as something that would be supernatural or paranormal or whatever term you want to use. I just think they're things that happen in nature. This is just the way things happen to be. And maybe if there is a soul, it is composed of some kind of particle or substance or essence that we haven't been able to measure or understand yet. But even if it's not, it doesn't have to be seen in some terms of the supernatural. And in fact, I don't even think there needs to be a god or gods to be able to have an afterlife that makes sense. I think there can be such a thing as an atheistic afterlife where that being of light that people are seeing, maybe it's just another soul of a person who's kind of advanced to a certain level. But I think the best evidence for all this stuff is for survival of the soul after death from near-death experience and reincarnation research. But the evidence for an actual God, I think, isn't there as much as there is for evidence for an afterlife.
No, I agree with you. My personal theory today, I tell everybody it could change tomorrow.
Yeah.
Is that we have a seed of a source or consciousness within us that has created a body to experience the physical.
Mm-hmm.
So that seed, that spirit, is what moves on. The body and the soul are of the earth plane, and so they will remain here, but the spirit will move on and create an avatar wherever else it's going to manifest to grow and to learn from that experience as well. So
Mm-hmm.
it's that's just today's theory. I've been working on it for a number of days, but no, more than that actually, because I feel the term God is too limiting, that
Mm-hmm.
the source is far greater than that. Now, where the source comes from, I have not a clue.
Yeah.
Yet another book, but it does feel that in our earthly experience here, we apparently need to have a source that we can make a person that we can worship that will take care of us. And the reality in my belief system, anyhow, is that the seed, the source is within us. It's the direct connection to that source. And we've got all the answers. We just have to go within instead of looking for other people to tell us.
I think that's a good thing to bring up too, because this whole field of study, it's not just it's not as cut and dried as people would like to think. Like, is there an objective afterlife that we all go to and it's all the same? It's more like there are layers of psychology, culture, possibly genuine spirituality, all these things that kind of intertwine. And so I think, when you die, depending on your psychological state, I think that's going to affect the experience. And that's, again, something that appears in Mahayana Buddhism quite a lot. Even with contemporary near-death experiences, people have distressing or negative NDEs, and sometimes they describe them in terms that are similar to a regular NDE. It's just that they were afraid. So they go through darkness, and instead of a loving, warm darkness, it's this terrifying darkness, and the being of light is oppressive, and all these things about the experiences is just scary rather than loving and enlightening. I think there are very, very few that are like that, and lots of distressing NDEs are more kind of confusional. That's just like darkness and scary stuff going on. That's not really.
Well, I have friends who honestly believe that there is a celestial nursing home in heaven, and I point out there has to be a greater purpose to the spirit we carry. It has to have a longer run than just a one-shot deal down here and it's make or break. It doesn't make sense to me. But no, when I die, I'm going to heaven and I'm going to be with my family and we'll live out eternity there. And I said, don't you think eternity is going to get really crowded after a while? but but again, it's a personal belief, and and with all the books that I've read and all the wonderful people I've talked to, I really have come to the feeling that there's a greater plan out there of some sort, rather than just recycling here over and over and over and over and over and over again. There's more to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book there someplace. Yet another book. But there are a lot of places that try to stimulate organically out of body experiences and near death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're triggered that way, are they as authentic as when you do it without the electronics that take you out of body, theoretically? Not sure I buy that. I think it's something we do internally. But the same thing with near-death experiences. There are people that literally try to kill themselves and then bring themselves back.
Mm.
I mean, is that as valid as what happens naturally?
I think that would be impossible to determine, actually. And I think it would be up to the individual culture to determine it, I think. So, like, for example, in some of the small scale societies, just another quick book plug because it's relevant.
Go for it.
In this book, Near Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, in this one I looked at Native American near death experiences compared to Polynesian, Melanesian, Australian, and sub-Saharan African near death experiences. And in a lot of these societies, especially, I'll just use Native American as a model, they really kind of valued near-death experiences as a genuine experience. They also valued dreams, but they saw near-death experience as a separate category. And then in between them, they saw like shamanic visions. So they had this kind of hierarchy that you're talking about. But at the same time, they genuinely believed that a shaman was able to send his or her soul to the afterlife and rescue the soul of somebody who's in danger of dying. So they would send their soul there through, taking drugs or drumming and dancing until they collapse, whatever kind of technique they used. Yeah. And then they would bring that soul back, and then that person would have had a near-death experience because they'd wake up and have had this kind of shared experience with a shaman. So it was very much taken seriously. And in Australia, that was one of the few regions of the world that I didn't find any examples of near-death experiences in the sense that there was the death and return context. I found lots and lots of examples of shamans going to the other world. And I gradually realized, the more I read, that they just weren't making any distinction at all. They were just saying people who had NDEs as shamans, and whether they died or not, whether they died and came back to life, didn't matter. It was the journey that was the important thing. And even more important was the information and the positive benefits that they brought back from the journey. So whereas in present day, I think there is a value judgment made on this. I know that in some kind of near-death experience support groups, there's people who have had genuine NDEs who are clinically dead for a time are seen as, at least by some people, at least by themselves, as being kind of on a higher level than people who had a spontaneous experience, but they weren't near death. And that's just kind of, to me, seems like an arbitrary value judgment, because you can't, if you haven't had somebody else's experience, how can you make a determination about how valuable it was? I guess from an external point of view, because clinical death is something we can measure, that adds a different level of evidence to it. But from the subjective view of what the experience was and how profound it was and how true it was, then I don't think anybody can make a determination about that.
Well, I think one of the things that to me is so impressive is that you pay more attention to your garbage man that has a near-death experience than to a pastor that has one.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of expect it of the pastor, but but when it's an experience that common folk have,
mm-hmm.
to me it carries greater validity because they don't expect anything like that to happen or occur.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And so what you get from them And again, I would love to see more detail in it. And you know, you're one of the first people that I've experienced so far that it has really gone into what did they see, how did it change their life, what did they do with the changes.
Mhm.
And you know, that's I think a field that needs to be looked into, because it it does alter the person dramatically.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's also for the people around them, it's such a profound, dramatic experience. I mean, it's a miracle, really, if somebody's lying there dead and you're preparing their funeral and the ritual is going on and the mourners are gathered and the goods are put in the tomb or
Yeah.
whatever, and suddenly that person wakes up. And then not
Yeah.
only do they wake up, that's an amazing thing, but then they start saying, I went to another world and I saw this being of light and I saw my relative and he told me to tell you this, all these kind of layers. So it's a profound experience for everybody who's in that whole situation. But just to kind of go back to the differences, because to me, I think the differences are equally interesting and valuable.
Yeah.
In some of these sub-Saharan African examples, they didn't value near-death experiences in the way that Native Americans did. And if somebody came back to life, they didn't think, oh, there's my mom who's just come back to life and I'm so happy, or my son, or my husband, wife, whatever it is. It was more like, uh-oh, this body has come to life. It must be possessed. It must be a victim of
Oh
sorcery.
yeah.
So they were pretty hostile to the whole concept of near-death experiences. And that's reflected in their beliefs and in their mythologies. They actually had myths about why people don't return to life. In fact, there's a very similar tortoise and the hare kind of myth, where the god tells a tortoise, you need to go and tell humans that they're going to return to life after they die. And then he tells the rabbit, you go to tell humans that they're not going to return to life after they die. And so the rabbit gets there first. And so this is why people don't return from the dead. So there's actually myths to explain why people don't have NDEs. And then there's religious practices. There were funerary rituals to prevent people from coming back, because they thought if that corpse is possessed, then it's going to, wreak havoc in the community or whatever. So we're going to bind them hand and foot. We're going to pile stones on top of the graves.
Yeah.
So we have far, far fewer examples of NDEs from those countries than we do from Native American cultures, where they place such immense value on it.
I mean, there was one. I believe.
Oh, sorry, you
Oh,
froze
we
for a second, so
froze.
I missed that last part.
Yeah. Yeah, it was probably so shocking. I froze the camera. There was one in which a woman was actually buried, and they dug her up,
Right.
and she was still alive.
Yeah. There's an Aztec example of that in the book too, about a woman, again, a historical person who actually existed. This is going back to the 15th century, and it was reported by a Spanish missionary. And he described this account, how this woman named Quetzalcoatl, who was killed by her father-in-law. Unfortunately, we're not told why or the circumstances surrounding it, but he was also a historical figure. So we know that these, were people who really existed.
Yeah.
And she was buried, and she said that she was greeted by a sickly, deformed youth, is how she described, rather than a being of light. And he then takes her soul and leads her on a journey to the other world. And she has a vision of the Spaniards coming. She meets
Oh
her
yeah.
deceased relatives. She meets her son, who had died earlier prematurely, and has various, very typical NDE type examples. And then she bursts out of her grave, essentially, and because she had already been buried at that point. What's interesting about that account, by the way, is that it was then retold by different missionaries over the years for the next 300, 400 years. And each time they Christianized it a little bit more. So
Yeah.
by the time we get to the 17th century, they've made her practically a saint and said she was the first indigenous woman to start baptizing her people. And then that version got accepted as truth by the Vatican, which is
Oh my
pretty
goodness.
interesting. Yeah. So rather than being a kind of like, here's an indigenous story with a warning about the invading Spaniards, it became
That was
adopted
accurate.
by the Spaniards. Yeah. Instead, it became adopted by them and used as kind of colonialist propaganda. Here's, this woman became converted and a model of a Christian indigenous person.
Well, but the aspect of a near-death experience and out-of-body experiences has come through time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating. It's the out of body is something that shamans and spiritual people have done forever, and it's almost a yeah, sure, everybody does it type thing.
Right.
But the near death experience, when I had the number of shows that I did on the near death experience, I was fascinated at how it changed people's lives. How it suddenly shifted their focus into being a more loving, kinder person. And if something can affect you that greatly, there has to be something to it. I'm sorry, it happens too many times. I would say that it's not 100% of the time, but I would say it's 90% of the time for sure.
There's an interesting difference, though, culturally, once again, that so in the West, people often come back and they're told they need to come back and care for their loved ones, or sometimes it's even a very personal thing, like you need to finish your writing your book or writing your PhD or whatever it is. But it's often caring for your loved ones. Occasionally, it's spreading the word about there really being an afterlife. But in a lot of other societies, it's more of a community-based thing. It's more about something that's you need to go back and do this thing that's going to benefit your community, like finding the plant that's going to cure the people of the plague.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting distinction to me, is that community-based thing, but in the modern Western world, it's all about me kind of thing, which is something that I guess it's just, again, a cultural influence that's interpreting the positive transformation in a way that's more personal rather than communal, because people have lost such a sense of community because we live in these giant cities, and so many people live almost entirely online these days. So, but it's an interesting difference anyway.
It is, and it's something that I think there should be more education with, because truly, and the more you can reflect on it, the more you can get it out there, the more people become comfortable with it and familiar with what you don't know really what the purpose is, but the experience itself. People are no longer, I mean, heck, look, a couple 100 years ago, I would have been burned at the stake for sure. And yet now I'm not. And so is the culture getting to a point where it will accept a spiritual experience as opposed to a religious experience?
Wow. Honestly, I don't know. I don't. Given the state of the world, I don't want to go into politics, but I don't really have a lot of faith that there's any kind of like spiritual transformation going on at a global level, to be honest. I don't want to be a downer, but
No, I agree.
maybe it's happening more on personal levels to more people, but it's hard to see a kind of movement that's especially one that's accepting the diversity and difference of other people. And I mean that in the sense of, even when people might accept the near-death experiences happen, there's still judgment going on about the content of other people's near-death experiences. So people can't get away from judgment of others. And I think that's, hopefully, that's one of the messages I'm trying to get across with my work. I'll give another example of an interesting cross-cultural difference. So we talked about how in the West, people are sent back to their bodies to accomplish something that they left unfinished, or raise their child, or whatever it is. in a lot of other societies in China, Japan, India, there are sometimes accounts where there was a clerical error in the other world. And the reason you're sent back to your body is because there was a case of mistaken identity, basically. So if I had an NDE, I'd be told, well, it says here, according to our records, we wanted the Gregory Shushan who lives in upstate New York. So you need to go back to your body. And then the person who has my same name in New York is then going to die permanently, and I'll wake up having had an NDE. So, to us, it does sound kind of amusing because it's not the kind of experience we're familiar with. But if somebody were to tell me about their NDE and they had that experience, I wouldn't then say, well, no, that you didn't really have a real NDE in that case. So I think there's got to be, and this has impact in the science of near-death experiences as well. Because when we've got scientists who are theorizing about NDEs, all of the theorizing from scientists almost has been done almost entirely on the basis of like a Western stereotype.
Yeah.
So I'll give a current example. You've probably seen in the news these claims where scientists have discovered that there's a burst of electromagnetic energy in the brain at the moment of death.
Yes.
And so they said, because this is a measurable thing going on in the brain, that's what causes the near-death experience, and particularly the life review. And they say that that's because all the barriers in consciousness kind of break down at that point. And it's that electromagnetic burst is basically all the memories firing at once. It's all released into the consciousness at one moment. And that's why you have this panoramic life review. But the problem with that is cross-culturally, that panoramic life review is practically unknown. It really is a kind of Western thing. So I mentioned that there's an evaluation of your life, and that's a very common, almost universal thing.
Yeah.
But the panoramic thing of it all happening at once is very Western. So that burst of electrical magnetic energy should be causing the same kind of experience everywhere around the world. So in this case, actually, the differences between NDEs are a challenge to those kinds of materialist scientific interpretations.
To me, science I had somebody on the show that broke everything down to molecules and nano everythings, and it's like, but there's something with the aspect of faith that can't be broken down into those itty bitty little pieces. And it's those people that have, I think, an inner faith. Maybe they have been using it, but it's those people that have a faith, not necessarily a religious faith, but a faith that there is more to this world than we are seeing. And it's you can't. I don't understand why scientists have to be able to, have it down on a piece of paper and saying, this is what we're talking about. You are just a whole bunch of little molecules that are held together by we don't know what, but that's what creates your body. And so that there's a physical, we have a formula for it. This is what your body is made up of. And the reality, they can't do that with consciousness.
Right.
Who was it? Was it Einstein that said, when you get into those realms, you're talking about the spooky stuff?
Yeah.
Because he couldn't understand, he didn't believe it either. And yet, Jung and Einstein and Freud all had experiences. So it's a matter of, where are you going to have to step aside and say, this has to do with faith? This has nothing to do with science. This is faith oriented.
Yeah, I think that's true. And for me personally, the reason I've been able to kind of, I think, look at this kind of stuff objectively is partly because of, my training, as I mentioned, as an archaeologist and historian and all that. But also because I wasn't raised with any kind of faith. So I don't actually even understand the concept of, like, if people say, well, has your work led you to believe in an afterlife? And I wouldn't say it has, because I don't even understand what belief is. I feel like there are things that I know and there's things that I don't know. So, and I figure I'll know for sure when I get there. But until then, it's like that Christian mystical text, the cloud of unknowing. I dwell within that cloud of unknowing. So as far as the ultimate answer goes, but I hope that the work is at least kind of reorienting some of the discussion about near-death experiences in general. And and even in the history of religions and in the humanities, people talk about these experiences. Going back to the example of the Aztec princess Quetzalcoatl, there's an article a few years ago about that case and how it was changed over time, and it was by an excellent Mexican scholar, impeccable research, but not once did he mention near-death experience, or did he put it in the context of near-death experiences. And I don't know if he just doesn't know about the experience, which is fair enough, or if he just thinks it's a woo-woo thing or what. But to me, I thought it's so obvious that this is an element of what's going on. And just the idea, I think looking at the diversity and all that is one thing, but all of it kind of loses sight of the fact that these experiences are being reported cross-culturally throughout the millennia. Just that one fact itself is so profound, and I think it just kind of gets lost in the rush to interpret it and to have a belief.
If it hangs in there over thousands of years, there has to be something to it.
Yeah.
It isn't, no story is that good that it will, keep snowballing through time.
Right.
Unless there's something to it that needs to be looked at and questioned and thought about.
Yeah. And scholars also, they will take the approach of, they will believe and listen to everything that their sources tell them. Just going back to anthropology, their sources are going to tell them about their religious beliefs, their kinship systems, their hunting and gathering and whatever it is. But when they tell them about a near-death experience, no, they must be lying. They must be making that part up. But they choose to believe all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Even though near-death experience is a cross-culturally recurring phenomenon, which we know. So there's a lot of ethnocentrism going on in academia, even among scholars who think that they're not.
Well, and with the technology we have today, with podcasting, with writing books, getting information out there so people can question it, and all you're doing is planting seeds, and they will grow this life or the next. They will grow.
Yeah, but I'm also hoping that, and with this book in particular, it originated in an academic project, but I wanted to write it in a way that was accessible to everybody, that was engaging, but at the same time not dumbing it down. I didn't want to insult readers by thinking, oh, you're not going to be able to understand the historical process or the method or why I looked at these texts and those texts. So I tried to explain it in a way that kind of brought readers into the journey of exploration, but also critical thinking. And to me, that's one of the important things that's missing in a lot of, I'm completely all for democratizing knowledge for everybody. And I'm really against academic elitism, but we can't throw out critical thinking on top of that. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to do with this book, and coming on podcasts like yours is just to talk about, we can be open-minded, we can be skeptical, we can be critical of all this stuff, but do it from a perspective of open-mindedness and critical thinking, rather than replacing one dogma with a new dogma.
Oh yeah, no, that's what I love about this show. I can present all sorts of material, and if it makes somebody think, my work here is done.
Exactly.
If you want to question it, fine, research it, go ahead. And the minute you plant that seed, eventually it grows, and it takes the person to another level,
right?
Whatever that next level for them is, which is, you can't determine what that is, but you plant the seed, and you did it beautifully. When I found Gilgamesh, I thought, no, that's not Gilgamesh. It's got to be a misspelling. No, it can't be a misspelling. and then you got to Gilgamesh, and I thought, okay, now I see where you came from. But
and that was another thing I wanted to, rather than cherry picking all the little bits that were just like an NDE and saying everything's the same all around the world and everybody had these NDEs and it's all the same. I really wanted to show that, like, here are the differences, here are the similarities within those differences, and how can we interpret all of that. So I also wanted to make it like a resource, so
Yeah.
people could understand the afterlife beliefs within each of these civilizations without, an external kind of interpretation of them. So I quote the text quite a lot, and I describe what is exactly what they say,
Yeah.
rather than putting my own spin on them. And then I talk about what they potentially mean. So those sections, I think, I'm hoping they could be a resource of just for people to turn to read about the afterlife beliefs in each of these civilizations, and kind of understand the similarities and the differences for themselves.
Well, it was an education in that way.
Good.
If nothing else, but the fact that the near-death experience was there and just hadn't been interpreted as such, is profound. And when you see it, you think, well, of course.
Yeah.
And again, a fact that if it's come through time, if it's still here, if we're still experiencing these events, there's got to be something more to it. And so it sets everybody to, in their own level of spiritual faith, take a look at it and say, look at that. It's still happening. It must mean something. If it's still happening after thousands and thousands and thousands of years, is this the way of another force helping us to be enlightened to something else that's out there for us?
Yeah, and I should also say that, that whole idea of these experiences influencing beliefs, in the book on indigenous religions, I actually found dozens and dozens of accounts of Native Americans and Polynesians and Melanesians and different people around the world actually saying, we know about the afterlife because this particular person went there on this date and came back and told us what he saw. So there's no debate that these people were basing their experiences on, or basing their beliefs on near-death experiences. We have it right from the horse's mouth, basically.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious belief either. It's a spiritual belief.
Yeah.
Which
well,
is
they didn't even have concepts of religion in a lot of these cultures. It was just, this is the way the world was, essentially.
That's so cool.
So, yeah.
That is so cool. Well, listen, our time is up, and I want to thank you so very much. This has been enlightening.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you.
And I'm going to definitely, your book is already on my website, and I'm going to recommend people check it out, because it definitely is a book worth reading that will make you think. Great. And that's the most important part. So I want to thank you again. And if you'll just hold on there, I will play my exit.